The whole art, I used to say, lives in a band no wider than a whisper. Cast iron is brittle because it holds too much carbon, 4%, sometimes more, and when you strike it wrong it doesn't bend, it shatters. Wrought iron is soft because it holds almost none, and though you can hammer it all day, it will never take a proper edge or carry a real load. Steel is neither. Steel is the narrow territory between them, somewhere in the range of a fraction of a percent to perhaps 2, and every property that makes it worth building with, the hardness, the spring, the edge that holds, lives in that carbon band. The whole art is hitting it. Not close, not approximately, hitting it. I'd explained this to Tae-ho and Seo-rin standing at the edge of the forge floor, the morning still cold enough that our breath showed against the orange light of the banked coals. The words came out plainly, the way I'd learned to say things in Iron Ridge, stripped of the vocabulary of the world I came from, rebuilt from first principles every time. Steel, I said, the same metal, with the carbon tuned just right. Too much, it's brittle cast. Too little, it's soft wrought. The whole art is hitting the carbon between. Seo-rin had her record board under one arm and her measuring cords looped at her belt. She listened the way she always listened, not nodding along, but holding the words still and examining them. It is a measurement problem, she said, wearing a blacksmith's apron. We don't guess the carbon, we control it and test until we can prove it. That was the frame she needed. Once she had the frame, she could build the record inside it. I didn't argue with the framing, it was correct. Tae-ho was quieter that morning than usual. He'd been quieter since the blast furnace runs, since the night he stood at the tapping channel and watched pig iron pour out in a river of light and said nothing for a long time. Something had shifted in him during those weeks. The man who had arrived at my workshop in the second month of all this, convinced that the gods had cursed his iron, had been replaced by someone who watched processes the way I watched processes, looking for the variable, not the verdict. We began with crucible steel, because crucible steel is controllable. The batches are small, a few caddies at a time, but the conditions are sealed and the inputs can be weighed to the grain. Tae-ho took to it immediately. He had always had the touch for enclosed heat. It was open air uncertainty that had frustrated him, the variables he couldn't see or name. Here, with a sealed clay crucible packed with measured wrought iron and measured carbon source, set into a coke-fired furnace and held at temperature until the melt was complete, he could feel his way through each stage with the confidence of a man who finally understood what he was feeling for. Sealed tight, measured to the grain, melted till it sings, he said, crouching beside the furnace door with his hand near the vent, reading the heat by the quality of the shimmer. No air, no guessing. This I can feel my way through. The crucible process gave us quality. What it couldn't give us was quantity. For that, we needed the converter. I'd drawn the design over several evenings, a vessel of refractory-lined iron, tilted on a trunnion so it could be poured, with a two-air arrangement at the base to blast air up through the melt. The principle is violent in its simplicity. Charge the converter with molten pig iron from the blast furnace, then drive a blast of air up through it. The oxygen in the air burns the carbon out, burns the silicon and manganese too, burns everything combustible in the melt, and the heat of that combustion is enough to keep the whole mass liquid without any external fuel. You watch the flame at the mouth of the converter as it burns. You read it. When the carbon is nearly gone, the flame changes character, goes from the long, luminous orange of a carbon-rich burn to something shorter and brighter, almost white. Then you stop the blow, and you add back a measured charge of carbon and manganese to hit the grade you want. Burn it all out, then put back the exact pinch that makes steel. It is crude, it is violent. The converter roars when the blast is running, and the flame at its mouth throws light across the whole forge floor. But it will make steel by the ton, and that is what Iron Ridge needs. Not precious small batches of crucible steel for fine instruments, but steel by the ton for crankshafts and axles and springs and the frames of machines not yet built. Tae-ho ran the first converter blow himself. He'd studied the drawings, asked his questions, and then set them aside, and stood at the converter with his arms folded, watching the flame. I stood back. There are moments when the right thing is to let a man work. The blow ran for several minutes. The flame at the mouth went through its stages, the early orange, the long luminous burn of the silicon going out, then the transition as the carbon load dropped. Tae-ho watched it without moving. His face in the converter's light was the face of a man reading a text he'd spent 40 years learning to read without knowing that's what he was doing. The spark went bushy to bright. Carbon nearly gone, he said, not loudly, more to himself than to us. A breath more. He held still another moment, and then, now stop the blow. The blast cut off. The roar died. The flame at the converter's mouth shrank and steadied. 40 years of fire taught me to read that. Seo-rin was already moving. She had her test rods ready, small samples drawn from the melt before the blow stopped, quenched in water, laid out on her bench in order. She worked through them methodically, hardness tests with a standard file and a set of reference pieces she'd made herself over the preceding weeks. Bend tests, where a rod is clamped and loaded until it either springs back or breaks, and the angle at which it breaks tells you something about the carbon and the grain. She recorded everything, every batch, every result, every variable she could name, the charge weight, the blast duration, the temperature of the pig iron at the charge, the carbon addition at the end, the quench method. Now spring steel isn't a feeling in his hands, she said, writing without looking up. It's a page anyone can follow. His genius made into instructions. The early batches were not all right. This was expected. The first converter run came out too hard. The carbon addition at the end had been slightly heavy, or the blow had stopped the breath too soon, or both. We didn't curse the batch. We read it. Seo-rin's records told us where the process had drifted. Tae-ho adjusted the next run. The second batch was too soft. The blow had run a moment long, burned past the target, and the carbon addition hadn't fully compensated. We read that too. Third run, we were closer. Fourth run, we were inside the range Seo-rin had defined for structural steel, the range where the hardness file cut with a certain resistance, where the bend test showed deflection without fracture, where the broken end of a test piece showed a fine, consistent grain rather than the coarse crystalline face of cast iron or the fibrous shred of wrought. The fifth run produced the first true steel. Tae-ho pulled the test piece from the quench bucket himself. It was a flat bar, perhaps 2 fingers wide and a hand's length long, drawn from the converter's last pour and quenched in water. He held it in both hands and bent it, not to breaking, just to feel the resistance, and it flexed and came back. He struck it against the edge of the anvil, and it rang, not the dull thud of wrought iron, not the sharp crack of cast. It rang, a clear sustained note that hung in the forge air for a moment before fading. He stood there holding it, and I watched his face. It bends and comes back, he said. His voice was different, not the forge master's controlled authority, something younger than that. And rings, he struck it again, listening. My whole life hard meant brittle, and here it is both, in my hand. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to add to that. What steel unlocks is not a small thing. I'd been working toward this point since the first weeks in Iron Ridge, since the charcoal-fired bloomery and the first rough iron bar, since the water wheel and the trip hammer and the blast furnace and the long months of building the tools to build the tools. Steel is the engine's heart, the crankshaft that converts reciprocating motion to rotation, the connecting rods, the valves, the springs that keep the valve seated. Steel is the vehicle's bones, the axles that carry load, the leaf springs that absorb road shock, the gears that transmit power without stripping under torque. And steel is, when the empire eventually comes with its army and its intention to take what Iron Ridge has built, the cannon that hold pressure without bursting, the barrels that don't fail at the breech. I said it plainly because it needed to be said plainly. The engine's heart, the vehicle's bones, and yes, when the empire comes, cannon that hold. Seo-rin was still writing. She didn't look up, but she heard it. The real triumph of those days wasn't the steel itself, it was the repeatability. A smith who makes good steel once has done something impressive. A forge that makes steel to grade, batch after batch, with records that tell you why each batch landed where it landed and what to adjust if it drifts. That is something else entirely. That is the difference between a man's knowledge and a processor's knowledge, between a craft and an industry. Seo-rin said it better than I could have. A smith used to be the recipe, she said, setting down her brush and looking at the row of test records on her bench, and it died with him. Now the recipe outlives anyone. That's the difference between a craft and an industry. Tae-ho was still holding the test bar. He'd set it down once and then picked it up again, the way you handle something you're not quite ready to put away. I watched him turn it in his hands, and I thought I understood what he was working through. He'd come to me in the early days as a man who believed his iron was cursed. Not metaphorically, he'd meant it. The mandate had withdrawn from his forge, he said. The gods had turned their faces away. The iron that had obeyed his father and his grandfather would not obey him. He'd been right that something had changed. He'd been wrong about why. The mandate, that inherited guttering magic that had smoothed so many rough edges in this world for so long, had been failing everywhere, not just in his forge. The iron wasn't cursed. The iron was just iron, and the old ways of working it had depended on something that was no longer there to depend on. What he'd learned since then, the chemistry of the blast furnace, the carbon arithmetic of steel making, the way a converter flame reads the burn, none of it was magic. It had never been magic. It had been waiting, patient and indifferent, for anyone willing to learn to see it. He didn't say this aloud, but I could see him thinking it, the way you can sometimes see a man arrive at the end of a long calculation. His face in the forge light was quiet and certain. The mandate was never in it. This was always here, for anyone who'd learned to see it. We ran 2 more batches before the light failed that evening, logging both against Seo-rin's records. The converter had found its rhythm. Tae-ho had found his. The steel coming out of those last runs was consistent. Structural grade, spring grade, the beginnings of what would eventually be tool steel once we had better control of the alloy additions. Each batch was a page in a book that would outlast all of us. I stood at the edge of the forge floor as the fires were banked for the night, looking at the row of test bars on Seo-rin's bench and the pages of records beside them. The veil outside was doing what it always did at dusk, the pale dome over Iron Ridge dimming slightly, the way it dimmed a little more each month, the slow retreat of something that had once seemed permanent. Inside the forge the coals still glowed. We had steel to grade, the carbon band, hit and held and recorded. Tomorrow was casting, the shapes too complex to carve from bar stock, the housings and brackets and bearing seats that had to be poured rather than cut. And after casting, forging, the parts too important to cast, the crankshafts and axles and connecting rods that needed the grain refinement only hammer work could give. The cathedral of fire, as I'd come to think of it, every process feeding the next, every capability unlocking the one above it. We cast the shapes too complex to carve, I said to no one in particular, and forged the parts too important to cast. Cathedral of fire tomorrow, and the hammer after. Tae-ho set the last test bar down on the bench beside the others. Seo-rin capped her ink and rolled her records. The forge settled into its evening sounds, the tick of cooling iron, the low breath of the banked coals, the distant creak of the water wheel still turning in the dark outside. Steel, the narrow band between too much and too little. We had found it, measured it, written it down. Now we would build with it.